we are a remarkably unwise society where we're very reactive and we use science. The worst thing we do in modernity is we rationalize our emotions through science to say that our emotional state is objective.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 192. This is the second conversation with Rudyard Lynch of the WhatIfAltHist YouTube channel. This is a very insightful channel which looks at current trends in world history. I mean, I think, and it's amazing Rudyard is not as old as he sounds. You also got a really good voice on that channel, Rudyard. You got a good documentary voice. You know, I don't know if you could go to work for Gerald Celente at the Trends Journal or some place like that, but it sounds like you got your own gig working pretty well for you, and that's good. So how are you today?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing fine. You know, I'm really intrigued by this video you have about what you call the four religions that are fighting for control of America. And if you can, first of all, start off by telling us, what the four religions are.
This was a video I released 5 days ago, and the four religions are Marxism, Christianity, Darwinism, and machine worship. And I came to this conclusion because you see this political discourse publicly, and then behind said discourse, you see that people operate under certain logical structures. And we pretend to be a much more uniform society than we really are. And I think that's true across a variety of levels, whether sexual, whether ethnic, regional, and ideological is another, or religious is another, where I see these people that have fundamentally very different visions of the world that are interacting with each other, and they're talking past each other because we don't notice that we're actually different religions who are competing with each other. And so it's this very covert battle, and philosophy is vastly more important than we give it credit for, in that philosophy determines the direction a society goes into. A society's philosophy is what its material conditions will be in a century. And so these battles over the religious or philosophic structure of our society are of the utmost importance, but no one thinks about them.
You're right. Most don't think about these big issues. I mean, maybe Rand might call it a sense of life.
Yeah,
which
Ayn
Rand called sense of life. You have this, and I did find it interesting. And I don't really know where I think I probably am somewhat of a Darwinist right now. I don't know if I've always been.
That's what I get.
And I don't know where you would be, but I'm definitely not woke. I'm definitely not. I was raised in the church, and I still appreciate some of the value that religion has brought to our world. I don't, but I also see the problems of it too. And I don't know if I would necessarily agree with your percentages, but they seem to be pretty right. So let's just.
Yeah. I mean, I made up the percentages. I pulled those numbers out of my ass, but I think at least one of them is vastly wrong. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if the Darwinists are higher or the Marxists are. I think at least one of those numbers is really wrong. That video has wanted me to make a reaction, or I often go on trails of videos where one video makes me want to make a sequel video, which makes me want to make another video. And the video that video made me want to make is the anthropology of normies, because I was trying to divide up the population into these four categories. And it made me realize most people are just normies who don't think about this stuff at all. And I saw a political assessment saying America is 1/3 red, 1/3 blue, 1/3 not caring. And they did an analysis of the not caring political demographic, and they're not like enlightened centrists. They're not people who have studied the positions and become to this principled middle ground. They're really just people who the analysis of the disinterested people is that they're not particularly intelligent. They're very materialistic. They're hedonistic. They prefer popular culture. They tend to be recent immigrants. And so when I was doing up these different religious categories, I'm thinking some truly vast part of the population doesn't care. And I think a lot of America is passively Christian in that they have a Christian moral code. They don't really see themselves as devout Christians, but if you put them in any category, they'd be passively Christian or passively leftist, but they haven't really thought through the ramifications, and they're mostly focused on their daily lives.
And I also think what you might have estimated for the percentages might be different if you live somewhere else, because I think what we see here versus other areas. But I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, that's something I've seen too, where I think America is a vastly more diverse country than people believe. And I don't mean diversity as in ethnic, as in white, black, brown. I mean diversity as in Texas versus Ohio versus Massachusetts versus California. Because having grown up in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is almost exclusively dominated by Christians with some Darwinists. And some, even in like Philadelphia, there's a leftist elite, but most Democrat voters in Philly are black people who are really Christian in their value structure. And so coming from Pennsylvania, it's an overwhelmingly Christian moral group. And people aren't really intellectual enough to jump to Darwinism. Well, in California, machine worship is huge out there. But I had no comprehension that machine worship was a real thing until I lived in California for a few months. I just didn't process to me as a choice. Yeah, I mean, America is such a crazy country, and you'll go to different areas, and different areas will have cultures that are completely incomprehensible to other areas. And Americans are remarkably unself-aware about how different their country is.
Yeah, and well, you know, even just the differences between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, which we talked about before. It's and a lot of people in Philadelphia have never been to Pittsburgh, and a lot of people in Pittsburgh have never been to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
But they're on, you know, two opposite ends of the same state, and you know, it's about 5 or 6 hours on the road, you know, and yeah. So
Pennsylvania is the size of England.
Yeah,
which is something I was on Twitter yesterday, and there was this whole thing of Europeans complaining about Americans not leaving their country, and then I made a tweet of overlaying America over Europe, where America stretches the distance from Kazakhstan to Ireland or Portugal, and that's the lower 48. If you throw in Alaska, you're going out to Greenland. So America, including Alaska, is wider across than the European continent.
Yes. Well, you know, it's also America's one of the few countries, you know, where most of the flying is domestic. You know, most I was out in El Salvador last November, you know, and there are no domestic flights in El Salvador because it's the size of New Jersey.
Yeah.
You know, every flight in and out of that airport is to another country. So it's, yeah. But yeah, so let's get into this. So we'll start off with just where, you know, you saw what you considered the smallest group was what you called the Darwinists, or what can you tell us about the Darwinists?
Darwinism is a philosophic trajectory that we really should have taken advantage more so of. In that, I think Darwinism is Darwinism is something everyone agrees with. Everyone except a couple hard Christians agree that evolution and Darwinism is an important mechanism. That being said, however, it's completely taboo to use Darwinism to understand the human condition, in which if you talk about social Darwinism, the English had their colonial empire because England was a superior country in certain ways, you're immediately canceled. If you say that capitalism naturally selects for better traits, canceled. And so in our society, we've used the Darwinists as this bogeyman to ally left liberalism and Marxism into the current ideology of managerialism. And so the Darwinists are the antithesis to the managerial ruling class, because the managers want everything to be safe and easy and structured. And Darwinism is an inherently chaotic, messy, bloody process. But that's both the greatest strength and the greatest weakness of the Darwinists. The fact that they are the outsider means that their hands are completely clean of the regime's insanity. But at the same time, it also means that I consider them to be the smallest group, because Darwinism is the only one of those three where if you write books trying to explain it as a worldview, you can literally have your life destroyed. You could write books from the machine worship, the Christian, the Marxist perspective, make them national bestsellers. But if you do that for Darwinism, it's just...
I think there probably was somewhat of an embracing of Darwinism up until World War II. And as you pointed out, the painter from Austria put such a black mark on it. It almost seems like everything that's happened since the end of World War II has been, let's not be like this horrible country.
Yeah. Yeah.
Germany.
That's definitely right. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is I heard Candace. I mean, there's lots of things I'm proud of. Something in my top 100 of being proud of is that Candace Owens once said that the reaction to World War II has been trying to be the exact opposite of the Nazis in every single way. And what a rational society would be to create an independent moral code that you follow irrespective of what the Nazis are. And I was the person who wrote that idea. I invented that idea. And I don't think Candace watched it directly. I think it went through conservative grapevine. But it felt good to realize that an idea I had invented, it's percolated that far outwards. And the thing there is that we are a remarkably unwise society where we're very reactive and we use science. The worst thing we do in modernity is we rationalize our emotions through science to say that our emotional state is objective. And so we made the science Nazis equal bad. And then we structured our entire society around Nazis equal bad. But we lacked the wisdom to be able to try to figure out these are the positive of the Nazis. If we follow this trajectory, this is what the natural end point is. And it just means our society is silly. The reason that we let in 15 million Latin American immigrants in the last 4 years is because stopping immigration is more racist, which is like the Nazis. Yeah. And that just or the reason that we say a man is a woman and a woman is a man is because sexism is like the Nazis. Our entire moral code is Nazis bad. And it's so crazy. We don't even reference reality. We ignore reality to be the opposite of whatever the Nazis is.
And I don't think you can define any kind of moral code as simply being the opposite of something, and of course, people still drive Volkswagens, and hey, I like bratwurst and I like dachshunds. So, it's those are things I like. So, and I did visit, I did go to Munich once and visit this little memorial, this little shrine that was built to the Schill siblings. So I'm definitely, that was my must see when I went to Munich, and I, went to the building where they got arrested and everything. It was just amazing. So, we certainly don't want to sound like we're apologists for the Nazis here, but
yeah,
I think there is, and Darwin, not to mention, I think science could, what would happen, for example, if we had science that we could all have, our vision would be twice as good as it is now. Everybody improve their vision. And the other thing too is you might have that same vision for your whole life.
Yeah. Do you mean that metaphorically or literally?
Well, I mean like your ability to see small objects, or your ability to see at a distance.
Yeah. Because you were saying that literally, but there's a metaphor in there too that I'm not sure you teased out, that if science existed to improve our vision, if it improved our ability to see things physically, that kind of science would also exist to improve our vision metaphorically. Yeah. In that it would let us just have a much better and more accurate vision of the world. And I have a theory that the reason we're so obsessed with the Nazis is that we don't know how to reconcile with the emotional turmoil and trauma that comes from both the world wars and the Industrial Revolution, where the Industrial Revolution created so many social changes so quickly that we don't really have a technique on how to deal with it. And thus, because of that, we say that nothing before the world wars is relevant. No data set before the world wars is relevant to our theory of the world. But we have to use the world wars as this bookend, for this is when the start of the relevant world begins. We don't take anything before the world wars seriously, so we have to make the world wars in like mythological terms. It's, you know, in Greek mythology, there's the point where Zeus and the Olympians kill the Titans.
I'm not really that familiar with Greek mythology, but okay, Zeus and the...
So in ancient Greek mythology, they have this, the new gods based out of Olympus. They kill their parents, who are the previous gods, who are the Titans, and they throw the Titans into hell. And so for us, the world wars are our version of that, where we completely reconstituted our mythological and our symbolic vision of the world so that none of the information before the world wars is relevant, because it operates in a different reality. Does that make sense? And so that's why we obsess over World War II so much.
Yeah, it seems like that. And of course, you know, just because it was such a big war, and so many people, it cost so much money and killed so many people. Yeah, and it was it, you know, got so many countries involved. I don't know, you know, you mentioned, you know, Kurt Doolittle and, you know, Bronze Age pervert. Would you also put the Tate brothers into the Darwinists? I probably would. Yeah,
they're definitely Tate brothers and the Red Pillars are there too. Where all red pill philosophy is an extension of Darwinism, where they use evolutionary psychology as their theory to explain the world. The Tate brothers aren't philosophers. They're lived philosophy.
Yeah.
In that their philosophy is their life. And I'm sure some 19th century philosopher read 1,000 pages about lived philosophy. But I think like Rollo Tomasi is another example of that. And yeah, I think another Darwinist thinker who I wouldn't underestimate, who I left out, is Catgirl Kulak. I think Catgirl Kulak is one of the sharpest new Darwinist thinkers.
Yeah, and I think Catgirl Kulak is actually a male, but
oh yeah, we're friends. I know him.
Okay, yeah. Love that. Catgirl Kulak on here. Yeah. There's definitely something. Rollo is good, and I think, and I've got to say too, my experience in the red pill circles, there's really no. I've not seen any racism in there at all among red pill. I mean, no, there's none. I guess when you get men together and they all just want to complain about women, they just maybe ignore their racial differences because they realize, oh, we all have the same complaints about women, but you know, it's
And I mean, also, there are certain racial types which are more attracted to the red pill. I think that's obvious. I think brown and black people have a higher affinity to the red pill than white guys do. And so one of my hopes is that the red pill pulls black and brown people into the rightist camp, that's a highway for them. But I also think that for the red pill has 3 or 4 lessons that are useful. And the problem I see with the field is that past those lessons, you hit diminishing returns. And there are way too very, very smart guys in the red pill for its own good. There's loads of red pill content creators who are absurdly intelligent. And I'm like, you're using this intelligence to repeat the same points again. And I also think the amount of sociopaths in that industry is vastly, vastly overrepresented. Because if you've used these skills and you keep using them forever without like settling down or, I don't know, finding a new hobby like politics or religion or whatever, I think that's a filter for sociopaths.
Yeah, I think also unfortunately, also the self-help industry in general, I don't think attracts a lot of quality people. People try to figure out their own issues. But, and as you correctly pointed out too, I think the growth of the Darwinism or the Darwinists is solely a reaction to the excesses of the left.
Agreed.
If the left had not went nuts, I don't think they would be here at all. I
agree with that. The left is so fucking stupid. I mean, it's just crazy to see their strategy. The left, they don't make calculations rationally. They exist off what assuages their insanity. And so they're not making decisions based off what makes sense. And the left 10 years ago, if they had changed a couple of their strategies, they could have totally won. If the left had changed a handful of things 10 years ago, they could have complete dominance over the West. They would have to not be explicitly anti-men. They would not have to devolve into trying to commit suicide. They would not. The left just established all these incentives. The left created a situation where if you're white or a male, you have no incentive to cooperate with them. And that is so eminently obvious. I realized because when I was 14, I moved from a conservative area in rural Pennsylvania to downtown Philly. And so I experienced culture shock going from a place with 0 wokeness to level 8 wokeness. And upon seeing that, I'm like, don't these people realize that they're creating no incentives to cooperate with them? And that I could tell that I read 1984 a year after I moved to downtown Philly, and that book changed my life because everything I saw in 1984 was things I saw in wokeness. And I thought, this is just going to get crazier because I saw that there was no feedback loop. There was no place where they analyzed what they were saying to say that we're absolutely crazy. It's just this hurricane.
Yeah, I think a lot of males who aren't white are seeing the same things as well. If they're just, you know, I've often joking, said every time a man gets falsely accused by a woman, Andrew Tate gets another follow on Twitter. It's because I know, when I was what 20 or 21 years old, when Mike Tyson was on trial for raping Desiree Washington, and I remember thinking I believed it completely, and I don't know how I would react to that whole thing now. It's he was convicted, but now there's so many other things, and I don't know. There's, as you said, there's no incentive to cooperate, and there's. Do you think there are any women who are Darwinists yet, or not?
Maybe. I think women will become. I think over the next 5 years, we'll see a wave of women pandering to conservatives because that's where they find the good men. Where there will be a significant demographic of women who realize there's a market imbalance where there's too many high-value conservative men and not enough women. So I think there will be a demographic of women. I don't think it'll be all. I think it'll be a significant amount, though, who will tilt right because of that. But as of now, Darwinism is just men. And I think that's indicative of the early stages of a revolutionary movement. I think if you went back to the Jacobins when they were founded, it would probably all be men. The first communists were all men. And I mean, crypto owners are 95% men.
Oh, yeah.
And the reasoning for this is that women don't have to take risks to survive. And so whenever you look at risky industries that are about going against the established status quo, it's always going to be 95% men. It's why my audience is 95% male. And one of my favorite authors, Amaury Duriancourt, he wrote a book on the history of gender relations, and he said, young women will always be the most vociferous supporters of whatever social order. You can tell when a revolution will succeed when young women support it. Because before the revolution hits critical mass, the young women are the most devoted supporters of the old regime. And then once the revolution picks up steam, young women become the most devoted supporters of the revolution.
Yeah, and I think women are just more likely to go along and get along and not take the risks or go against the grain. We don't have that many. We don't have that many great explorers who are women, or or great inventors who are women. But I think that and not to mention there's also the IQ imbalance. I mean, men and women both average at 100, but there's a lot more really high men and a lot more really low men. So I think we covered, then you mentioned, the machine worshipers or the tech worshipers, as we can call them. I mean, this is definitely something I find interesting. What do you notice about them?
I am adjacent to technology. And so I know I'm friends with a lot of people in technology. And so I am not a techie, but I know them very closely. And so I think it's a field where I'm close enough to know what's going on, but I'm far enough away to be objective. And tech has a lot of very admirable traits. It's incredibly intelligent. It's very inventive. It's mechanically incredibly advanced. Tech are the only people who can actually think outside the box today. And that being said, they lack in wisdom what they make up for in intelligence, where there's this large demographic. And the thing about tech is that when I say large, the people who are part of machine worship it's a couple million people, only a few thousand who actually have influence. I think most of the I said it's 15% of the population. I think most of the people in the machine worship category are just passive utopians. They think that, oh, if we make these 3 new technologies, we'll live in a utopia. Then you have a small cadre who are completely obsessed with it, and they think that AI is about to make the rapture, and it's called the singularity. And again, that sounds like I'm making it up, but the top people in technology do think that we can develop an AI that will completely change human nature. The AI will become a god, and it will usher in a new utopia or the death of the human race. And my background's in history, and as a historian, I look at that and I think, you guys are literally just rationalizing what so many religions believe. Because human mythology naturally enters into certain archetypes that you see repeated again. And one of those archetypes is the rapture, which is exactly what the singularity is. And I frankly don't see that much evidence that AI will become a god. I mean, I see evidence that AI will become an incredibly powerful technological force. But the jump to saying this is the new god, that requires a leap of faith. And the thing is that for people, a lot of very powerful people, they believe this with complete certainty. Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Altman, Elon Musk believes it, but he believes it in reverse, in that he builds his life around fighting the future singularity. And so among this very small cadre of powerful, wealthy people who I refer to in the video as almost like wizards or mages in fantasy novels, this is the idea that animates them.
Yeah, you know, I was going to ask you, Elon's an interesting, because I think Elon might have his foot in both tech and Darwinist.
Agreed.
One thing that bothers me is there's this attitude that humans are very flawed, and humans certainly have flawed, but that machines can't make mistakes.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a calculator and the calculator's battery power gets low, or it's low on batteries, it will make errors. Or if I've seen computers, you know, give wrong answers to math problems.
Yeah.
It does happen because of how they're built to calculate it. Or
yeah. I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's something I've thought about, but I haven't shared on the channel yet, in that a lot of technology and technological philosophy is animated by a kind of loathing of human nature. And it's not rational. It's people who I think subconsciously realize that they have not developed how they would like. They rationalize that as a dislike of human nature itself. And they've had positive relationships with machines, and thus they think machinery is better. And I'm a nerd. I don't want to devolve into nerd blaming. But I think it is a fair answer, where if you have this demographic of people who have very good relationships with the machines around them and bad relationships with the people around them, it goes to reason that they would develop a worldview which prioritizes the growth of machines and the weakening of people.
Yeah, that's wonders, you know, about their relations, you know. And I was always, I mean, my dad was, my father, you know, of course, he was born in 1931, but he always said to me that he didn't like computers because he felt like they made people lazy. And dad could, if you gave dad a pair, you know, just said 23 times 51, dad could do it in his head as fast as a calculator as you could do it on a calculator.
Yeah.
And it does seem that way, you know, almost that, because I wonder if we develop these devices, you know, ebooks, that we might even get to this point where people don't learn how to read because they don't have to anymore, which I think would be kind of a tragedy. Or
yeah, I've thought that too. I've wondered if we would stop being literate because technology gets so advanced. Yeah. I mean, what your father said is such a greatest generation mindset, where, like, my grandfather lives during he was World War II generation. And so he would do stuff like he would save up plastic bags under the sink, because if you grew up in the Great Depression, you pinch pennies. And it's funny
Yes.
that it's 2010, and he ended up with decent money. And I'm thinking, dude, you don't need to keep the plastic bags under the. You don't need to have a month worth of supply of canned food at all times. But he lived in the World Wars and the Great Depression, so that's what he grew up with.
Dad was definitely that way, but going back, or even people, being able to do math problems on by hand and stuff. It's even
I think
now,
math problems,
and even now it seems, when you pay cash, somebody might make an error. It's like, oh gosh. So, and I'm going to assume also that the tech worshipers are also very male as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, if I'm being completely blunt, the category of people I developed who are the non-politically adjacent, the three categories that'll be overwhelmingly female, the majority female, Christians lean female, Marxists lean female, and the non-affiliated category leans female. Darwinism and machine worship lean very heavily male.
Yeah, I don't know where that'll change. It's what do you think? Curious. Obviously, we don't know who he is, but which category would Satoshi Nakamoto go into?
I really don't know. I think Satoshi probably was I would put Satoshi in the Uncle Ted category. Where the video I'm writing now is about the Unabomber. And you can't fit the Unabomber into any one of those four categories. And I guess Satoshi is comparable.
Maybe so, yeah. I wonder who else do you don't think fits in any categories?
Yeah, so when I made this video, I considered having a different framing than the four. And so I considered making it about Western civilization, not America. And the reason I backed off from that is that Europe doesn't fit into the American paradigm. And I didn't want it to be 100 and I didn't want it to end up becoming 100 minutes or an hour and a half. And so if you want to, I'm using Europe as an example. If you were to expand it to Europe, you would throw Islam in as a faction. You would have the European ecological left. And the Unabomber called them eco-fascists. Yes. Because the European ecological left is different from the American race-based left in an important way. And I think they've devolved into Mother Nature worship. There's more Wicca elements, more Gaia elements in the European eco-fascism. Then you have the European right doesn't believe in anything. It's like if you were to go to Giorgia Meloni or Marine Le Pen, I have no clue what they believe. They're not really Darwinists. They don't believe in God. And it's just this nihilistic force that I don't know where it's going to go somewhere. And the irony is that if I were to make this video at Europe, nihilism is the biggest belief structure. And the Americans America's nowhere near as nihilistic as Europe is. But the ones that I considered doing besides the categories I made is I considered making a nihilism category. I considered making a normie category, people who don't care. And then I considered putting classical liberals or libertarians in a separate category, but I don't think libertarianism is really a religion. I find libertarians either tend to be Darwinists or Christians. And I think the big reason classical liberalism survives is Christianity, where if you removed Christianity on a social basis, you would remove Darwinism, you would remove classical liberalism as well.
Yeah, that's interesting too. You mentioned Meloni and Le Pen. I mean, what about Viktor Orban and Nigel Farage?
I have no idea what they don't know what they believe. Yeah. If I asked them, they would say, I believe in the English people. And I'd say, what does the English people stand for? And it would become this secular argument of, we stand for the existence of the English people who stand for themselves. And none of these people have positive values. And it's true of the European left, too. I mean, the European left believes in killing themselves. And the European right, once they lost God, they believe in their national... European politics has devolved into whether or not our country should survive.
Yeah.
Like, I know my friend Sargon has gone into Evola, but I don't think Sargon actually believes the mysticism that Evola, because I know Sargon and he's an atheist. I don't think he believes like the esoteric hermetic mysticism that Evola talks about and upon which Evola's worldview is founded.
Sargon's an interesting character. You know, also another person I just realized on the right, that Eva, Dutch girl.
Boa. Eva von der, the hot one.
Yeah, really cute. Yeah, really cute Dutch girl. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, the thing with the European right is no one believes in anything in Europe. Where, I mean, what positive values does the European left pull on either? Yeah, and the problem is what we're seeing in Europe is what America will be in 20 years if we don't change. Yeah, and I think we as Americans have to make the choice to change to not reach the levels of nihilism in Europe.
Yeah, that's going to be a struggle. I don't know where, and you know, none of these. Yeah, so I think we've probably covered Europe enough. So then you moved on. You know, then you moved on to the you know, the woke, the Marxists. I mean, yeah, as you pointed out, it's really shocking that this exists at all. And I'd say 25% is probably about right where they are.
Yeah.
But they're in all the important institutions.
Yeah, and just about. The wokies are also interesting in that someone did a statistical analysis where about a third of Americans are leftist or leftist sympathizing, but most of that is normies, and only about 10% are actually woke. And that if you ask them about defunding the police or reparations or forced equity, only about 10% of Americans believe in this stuff, and frankly, I have no idea how you could be a moderate left-winger. Like, if you're a moderate left-winger and you're constantly being cucked out by the hard left, like, what kind of life is that? And I take pride in calling out the hard right, but I know of no one on the moderate left who calls out the hard left and then doesn't immediately defect to the right, like Shuon Head or Russell Brand. But, yeah, I mean, so there's like the 10% of the population who are the ones who are orchestrating all of society. And they use the university system to take over every major institution, whether the government bureaucracy, Hollywood, the media, academia, the school system, the upper brass of the military, a large part of the police, even defense contractors and finance and the corporate world. And one of the points I talk about in that video is that the left went from this philosophy of empowerment to philosophy of suicide, where the left 10 years ago was all about, we should support gay people, we should support black people, we should build a better country for all of us. And if you asked a leftist 10 years ago, do you hate white people? They'd say, no, we love white people. We want to make an America that's beautiful for everyone, and white people benefit from that. And if you ask leftists today, do you hate white people? They're just going to say yes. And you ask the left, because I try to read what leftist outlets are saying, and the things leftist outlets publicly say now are absolutely ridiculous. And I have a test where I look up, is there a single form of degeneracy that the mainstream left hasn't defended? And these are places like The Guardian, the BBC, CNN, NPR, and those platforms have written positively of cannibalism, pedophilia. They've written against having children. They've written against thinking for yourself, and it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and you know, it's also largely been, you know, I think the other thing is, you know, it's always been about glorifying victim status.
Yeah,
how big a victim, and you know, whether or not you really are a victim, or whether or not you're just you know, whether or not you're just losing because you're losing. You know, it's so, I don't know how this ever got taken seriously.
Yeah,
and it's just, and you know, we're almost 35 years now from the Berlin Wall falling, and
yeah,
it didn't go away after that. It just got worse.
Yeah.
I don't see how there's any plausible excuse for embracing any of this now. And Trump, and they really took the gloves off when Trump got elected, and then they took them off even more during coronavirus. And
yeah, exactly. I agree with you there. And this is why I've gone so hard for Mouse Utopia, because I believe Mouse Utopia, because there are too many. The way my mind works is I see a bunch of different possible predictive outcomes, and I think with the new information I'm seeing, which of these mental models does it make sense in? And over the last 4 years, and this is the thing I've really changed my mind on last even 2 years, is I've seen so much new data that only makes sense in mouse utopia, where the left winning could only make sense in the mouse utopia scenario, where mouse utopia explains every single reason why the left won, and there's no way that a non-mouse utopia society would do it.
Yeah, I'm largely come to the conclusion that that is the best solution for Europe. As awful as that sounds, just stop breeding and have wide open countries, and other people can just move in, and take over. I hate saying that especially about Britain, because just there's such an amazing tradition of liberalism there, and I only say that about Western Europe. I think Central Europe has resisted at the former communist countries because they had wokeism shoved down their throats by a foreign power for 40 years. That's made them hate it to a certain extent.
Exactly. It gave them an inoculation. And I was watching a video, Konstantin Kisin?
Yeah, I know who that is. Yeah.
I was watching a video of his where his family, they're Jews from the Soviet Union, and he was talking about how the Soviet Union had policies that sound directly out of the West today. He talked about political correctness was a term from the Soviet Union. Yeah. They had diversity quotas. People would fake more proletarian identities to get jobs. And I'm thinking, how come all of this happened already? And we're such idiots that we didn't even notice. And my dad studies Marxism as a hobby. And so I grew up hearing this stuff. And so I could immediately draw the connection between this is what it looks like. This is old Marxism and this is new Marxism. And it really, our solipsism is so shocking, where to get someone to even study something 40 years ago is impossible. To get the public to know about Mao or Stalin, and there's the sort of glibness that politics today where people are just like, ha ha ha, we're not Stalin or Mao. And I'm like, okay, prove it. And like, ha ha ha, we're not Stalin or Mao. There's this certain sense of naive glibness to politics today where you can't get people to take anything seriously. And the crazy thing with wokeness is this is legitimately a nihilistic suicidal death cult. But if you say that, everyone's like, okay, schizo. And the thing for me is I'm stuck here. I am stuck with the results of what happens now for a long time, hopefully. And it's crazy to see how naive and glib the general public is about this stuff, because wokeness is deadly serious. And if we don't stop it now, it's going to consume everything.
Yeah. It was also, Rachel Wilson was also talking about apparently that in the early days of the Soviet Union, they had fully funded abortions, and apparently they were actually on the verge that they might very well have aborted themselves out of existence.
Yeah, I knew that they had...
that wouldn't have been a tragedy. Now would have been, but anyway.
I knew that they had abortions in the beginning of the Soviet Union, and that Stalin made he made abortions illegal. I read an interesting book that talked about this, where they said, the Soviet Union's birth rate crashed incredibly rapidly, more so than it should have in a non-communist country, where they went from 7 children per woman when the Soviet Union was founded in 1920 to being beneath replacement levels in the 1970s. And for a comparison, America is a better developed country, and better developed countries tend to have lower birth rates. But America went beneath replacement level in 2010, 40 years after the Soviet Union, which is absolutely insane, since the Soviet Union was a more rural, it was a more primitive, whatever society. And the book that I read that talked about this, it said that the author said that the child rearing in the hospitals and the culture of the Soviet Union was so sterile that it wasn't conducive to motherhood and parenthood, where we have records of Soviet moms going to the state hospitals and saying that the state hospitals were traumatic in of themselves. And again, this is a society, you have to use the state service. You can't get a midwife. And they made women work, and they also made them take care of the kids. And so Amory Durignacor, his analysis of Soviet feminism was it's feminism on paper, but the reality is that Soviet women weren't treated very well. And there was this, when the Soviet Union was founded, they had free love, where they, when the Soviets would conquer a Russian town that wasn't previously Soviet, they would write down the names of all the women in the town, and then they would, the Russian soldiers would make a check mark to rape them. And it was supposedly Soviet free love, but it was really a way of basically doing state-sanctioned rape for the soldiers.
Yeah, which they also, and they certainly did that in 1944, 1945 as well.
Yeah,
it's that was rape culture, you know, which is a term we hear in America, but we don't have anything like that.
Yeah, it's also funny that rape culture gets thrown around by like college-aged white guys, where as a college-aged white guy, like the young white guys are like one of the least toxic masculine demographics ever. You would really, like, I hear a lot of stories from baby boomers about the crazy things that went on in their youth. That's completely unidentifiable to guys my age. And I mean, the real point that the left will never go to is applying rape culture to black rap culture, because rap culture is something that actively promotes it. But if they cross that barrier, that's something that it's just, the left has so many ideological contradictions that they can't push against because it breaks apart their coalition building.
Yeah, they ignore the misogyny in the Islamic world too. It's really amazing.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, gays for Gaza, who thought that was a good idea? And like, the people involved aren't stupid. A lot of these are very high IQ, educated people, but just they lack wisdom. And I'm thinking, how do you lack? I mean, I actually think it's a form of shit test. I think that they are ridiculous on purpose as a form of shit test to shove down society's throat, because by making us believe absurdities, it's a sort of power game.
That's very, very insightful. And, you know,
I have an example of that for the trans issue, where I frankly don't think anyone really believes in trans. I think the human mind has multiple layers to it, and we all have like this deep collective unconscious soul, which is, it's why I automatically shudder when I hear a rattlesnake, or it's why you start getting horny when you see a beautiful woman. And there's that layer, and that layer knows deeply that men and women are different. But I think for the trans thing, it's partly a way to shove down it. Once you shove something that absurd down someone's throat, they can't disagree with you on anything, because at that point you've got them to agree with complete falsehood to get them to agree to anything, because they've put faith above reason. And secondly, it's a way to remove any conversation about the biological differences between men and women. Because if you say they're so similar that they're interchangeable, women get to have all the advantages of being men without any of the weaknesses. We're never really going to make women be drafted in the military. We know that's not going to happen. If they do it, they'll be in backline roles. But if you say there are no differences between men and women, you can get women to not be responsible for being sluts, or for not taking care of children, or not doing GSR. And then you won't enforce the negative parts of being a man. And so the trans is an example of using an absurdity as a way to control the discourse, to not let it go in directions that aren't useful for you.
Yeah, GSR, gossip, shaming, and rallying, as you like to say. Yeah, it's so. It seems like this is a bubble that just has to burst. I don't see how. But you know, as I've often said, you know, if you believe in Social Security, you'll believe in anything. So, you know,
I would support Social Security 100 years ago.
Yeah.
If we had the demographics, I mean, this is an issue where, for my business, I made a lot of business decisions when we were doing well financially, and then we had a year when we were doing poorly. And so these tiny decisions I made ended up being huge differences in a different business climate. And I see that with the economics of countries, where Social Security is completely rational when Teddy Roosevelt was around, or if FDR was around, because the average life expectancy was 66. And so if you give someone Social Security at 65, congrats, you got money for a year. And now the demographics have changed completely, and it's not like there's no way I'm ever going to get that. Why am I going to? And if you're an employer, the Social Security you pay is horrifying. I have real beef with employment taxes and corporate tax, but that's a different story.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, that's a different story. But as you were pointing out too, I think it's also, the anti-natalist stuff, America is about the only modern country. Well, except for other than the really Orthodox Jews in Israel, is about the only other country that's modern that I can know where you still can encounter people with big families.
Yeah. It's a real white pill living in Texas too, where the area where I live, it's families everywhere. And it's like native born white Americans too. And I think it's something to do with its religion, and the two factors which control whether or not you have a stable birth rate are ruralness and religion. An important thing to keep in mind is that America is half suburban, while most developed countries are majority apartment dwelling urbanites. And so I think that allows larger families. And also America is the most religious country in the developed world.
Well, America is still, compared to Europe, sparsely populated.
Yeah, it is.
Although Canada and Australia are even more sparsely populated, but they have lower birth rates.
It very much shocks me that Canada is such an open country, but at the same time, the cost of living is so high. I used to live outside Toronto, and Canada's significantly poorer than America, but the cost of living is vastly higher than America because it's all concentrated in these handful of basically colonial cities that dominate the rest of Canada, where, man, Canada's not a country that's doing well. I lived there in like 2014, 2015, and that was the one period where Canada was doing better than America, and they crashed and burned.
Yeah. They definitely have. It's, and Lawrence Southern was talking about, healthcare in Australia is a lot better than Canada, even though they both kind of have the same system. I found that, but she had lived in Australia for a while. But so we've covered the woke. Now we probably should, we want to cover the Christians because, as you pointed out, they're still about half of the.
Yeah.
What can we say about the Christians? I mean, these are still. They're. I'd say that's probably about right. Although I don't know how Christian they are, and there's definitely different factions among them.
My question to you is: of the four groups, which do you think I got wrong for the rough statistical size?
I might have put Christians maybe more at 40% than 50%, but it's really hard to say. I think Darwinism at 10 was about right. Maybe a little more. I think the woke is at 25 is about right. Yeah. So I think the variable we're leaving out is that there's a large demographic of the unaffiliated, and so I put more of the unaffiliated as Christians because if you're just naturally born into America, you'll grow up with a passively Christian value system, and you have to. If you grow up in a coastal place, you'll grow up in a passively Marxist value system. And I can't put machine worship at more than 15%. Machine worship is pretty rare in America. For the Christians, they are the most different between the other three, in that the three other philosophies are modernist, mechanistic worldviews. And the Christians are the only one that has a concept of the soul and a spirit world and of moral values independent from material stuff. And that's both their greatest strength and the greatest weakness. Yeah.
And Christianity is like, those pictures where they say, which of these is not like the other? Christianity is the one that's not like the other. And that Christianity is an actual religion, while the other three are, the other three are poorly developed philosophies. They should be like Confucianism or Buddhism, but they haven't gotten that far. And because the modern world is so materialist, it can't develop interesting ideas. We haven't developed new ideas in 200 years, new philosophic ideas at least. And we're just recycling philosophic ideas from 200 years ago. But Christianity, it has a it's an old philosophy, and the greatest strength of Christianity is that it's intellectually the best developed, and it also allows the best path for self-discovery, where the other philosophies outsource happiness and life to, if you give this elite power, this elite will construct a utopia so you're happy. Christianity says, be a nice person, believe in God, you'll be happy. And I think the Christians offer a better path, and their path will more likely lead more people to happiness. And the problem, though, is that a majority of the population finds it physically impossible to actually believe the things Christians say. And I think a large demographic of the Christians are people who are passively Christian, but I don't think they actually, like, I know lots of people. Where I grew up in Pennsylvania, it was majority mainline Protestant churches. And you know a lot of people who are Presbyterian or Lutheran or Unitarian who go to church, but if God spoke to them through a burning bush, they wouldn't believe it. And there's a sizable demographic of that. And the problem the Christians will keep butting up against is that in our worldview, as we understand it now, Christianity doesn't make any sense. We don't have a concept for spirits or of the soul, or everything is mechanistic and scientific and atomic. And I've spoken about in other videos why I personally don't think that's an accurate vision of the world. And I understand I'm incredibly biased here, but I do think that in the next century, we will have a discovery relating to the spirit world. But I would, if I were you, I would discount my ideas about this because I have such a horse in this race. But but I mean, the thing is, the Christians have the best developed worldview, but also it's so different. It's so isolated from the rest of the society that they struggle with even getting to cooperate with people. In the church has experienced incredible brain drain, and it's also filled with nice guys and tradition seekers. The church has had all the wrong selection pressures against it for being a functional organization.
Yeah, what gets me, is the way the church has just rolled over and played dead during the coronavirus stuff. And
yeah,
and I've got to say also that you don't really find a lot of them just aren't very smart. I'm sorry to say. The brain drain thing is, but the smart ones are really great people. It's
yeah. The other thing,
when you talked about a spiritual breakthrough, I wonder if something like that might come via psychedelics.
Yeah, I definitely think. I think it's through psychedelics because those have become mainstream.
Yeah.
And another thing is, did you watch my video on the CIA's research into the spirit world?
I think I might have watched that. I don't know if I were.
So the CIA had decades worth of research into the spirit world, where they had hundreds of people, and almost all of them went to the spirit world, and they spoke to gods and demons and different spiritual forces. And the military's independent assessment of the CIA's science was that it was all correct. And the Soviets did their own experiments at the same time, which came to the same conclusion. So we have multiple government agencies from the most powerful countries in the world saying and the Soviets also did multiple versions. There were studies in Czechia, which found the same thing. And there were studies in Moscow, which found the same thing. And, or Russia itself, not Moscow. And so multiple government agencies from the most powerful countries in the world independently reached the spirit world. And that really clicked a bell for me because this is something that everyone until the 20th century across history believed. And this is something that we've written out of the history books, but Isaac Newton spent as much time studying the spirit world as he did physics. Charles Darwin, Queen Victoria, Karl Marx, Isaac Asimov, Nikola Tesla, all of these people believed in the spirit world with complete certainty. Up until World War I, the smartest people and the most educated people in the world were studying the spirit world. And both Nikola Tesla and Nikola Tesla has a quote that once we use science to study the spirit world, more discoveries will occur within a 20-year period than the last 300 years combined. Yep. And Isaac and Thomas Edison was trying to build a machine to speak to ghosts. And so this is a thread that has been going on for a very long time. And it's really been basically a single lifetime that the consensus didn't believe in the spirit world.
Yeah, that's yeah. I don't know if that's, and I wonder if that's part of what our problem is that we've lost belief in something outside ourselves, you know, and it's just like us, you know, and as I like to ask people, you know, imagine you go to another planet and none of the creatures living on that planet have a sense of hearing, so they don't know what sound is.
Yeah.
Now imagine you go to another planet and the creatures who live there have a sensory system that we didn't know existed, you know?
Yeah. That's what the CIA's research in the spirit world said. They said the spirit world operates off a sixth sense that humans don't have. And they said that small groups of humans, what the research in this topic said is that 1% of humans have a genetic ability to interact with this stuff. And that requires training. And so in pre-industrial religions, a lot of the esoteric organizations were training for that 1%. And if you look at, there was a point when logical thinking, speech, when the ability to dance or sing, when those were genetic abilities that only a small part of the population had. And I think the other people would say that, oh, logical thinking isn't real because only a handful of people can do it under weird circumstances. But once it grew across the population and once it got institutionalized, it just became something that was reflexive. And Carl Jung said that modern man is cut. And the metaphor I hear about from a lot of esoteric and religious writers is the modern worldview is a single searchlight pointed at the sky. And with previous worldviews, and this is something where I read a lot. I've read a lot of medieval primary sources. And if you read a medieval book on a foreign country, they'll talk about the food that people eat. They'll talk about the manners. They'll talk about the history, the culture, where the medieval worldview was very holistic, and it's very, it's a lot of discrete parts thrown together. And if we were to read a modern book, it would hyper-focus on the economy, the politics, and it wouldn't talk about those other variables because our worldview is very boxed apart and very mechanistic. And so we lack the ability to look outside of the box that we're looking at. And so we end up getting slapped in the face by obvious things where, like modern art, we all know modern art is terrible, but because our box of mental thinking doesn't have a paradigm for us to explain why it is terrible, we fall for it. Or the same thing with the trans or modern monetary theory. How the hell did we fall for that?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, it's when I think about the spirit world, I always go back to my mother knowing when her father died, so much that she got up out of bed and called the hospital.
Damn, that's crazy.
He's gone, you know. Sorry
to hear that.
Yeah, well, this was years ago. I mean, I was 5 years old at the time, but you know, it was also funny. We were at Myrtle Beach, and so Dad got up and said, "Oh, we got to go home," you know. So, you know, having our beach vacation, and so that was but so yeah, but it's so. And I've heard of other things like that happening too, where people just knew these things had happened.
That's happened to me. The reason I started studying geopolitics is I had a stabbing pain in my stomach for 2 weeks in high school that the world order was going to end. So I started studying geopolitics because I wanted to figure out what it was from.
Yeah, I don't know what you think about things like ESP, but it's certainly a possibility there. There's a lot of different things. You know, I do think another thing that is a strength and a weakness for Christianity is the idea that everybody is redeemable.
Yeah, agreed. Christians devolve into being too soft, where people blame the Christianity of burning witches or the Crusades, but that was a Christianity that at least had a spine. It did bad stuff, but it had a sense of, if you break our rules, we fight back. And modern Christianity has none of that. And so Christianity has become way too feminized to be a competitive ideology.
Yeah, and you do hear things, still, and not for everybody, but well, I was, I had a drug problem, but then I started going to church, or I was an alcoholic, but then I started going to church. And, if this keeps you from being an alcoholic, keep doing it. But I think that does help people repent for their mistakes and does
Yeah.
help improve themselves.
A problem I've had is that I've gone to church for a majority of my life, and I just don't see a reason to keep doing it. For when I was a teenager, when I was a child, we went to church, but as an adult, I just don't like, what am I getting out of this? I know what the pastor is going to say in the sermon. I already know what the religion's about. I keep a pretty good control over myself. And if I go to church to hear a sermon, that makes it more likely that I don't do the thing. Because if the pastor tells me to do the thing, that makes it more likely that I just don't do it. Because that's how my mind works. And I think Christianity has boxed out people who don't fit into a box of that they know how to deal with. And if you went back to Christianity 500 years ago, they had monks, they had mystics, they had friars, they had organizations for people who just didn't want to go to church weekly. But if you don't like church, modern Christians tell you it's your fault. You have to change until you get something out of church, rather than it's our responsibility to change, to make something that's valuable to you.
Yeah, I do think but I also think, religion still was in many respects the social life of a lot of communities, and there is no social life without the church. It's or at least in a lot of places there wasn't really a social life without it.
Yeah.
The one thing that bothers me is it seems like even though you have a lot of people who call themselves Christians, you still see as much divorce,
Yeah,
or illegitimacy and stuff like that. I assume it varies via sex. It seems like sect says an SECTS, but it seems like obviously, like the Amish and the Mennonites, they seem like they're really serious. I don't think you see a lot of divorce among Amish, and maybe the Orthodox, but
what I would say is that if a religion is completely all-encompassing, it has recursive benefits, in which if you're in a society which is very Christian, everyone goes to church, everyone believes the thing, you can shut down stuff like divorce, you can shut down antisocial behavior. But the problem is that if you're in a society that doesn't have that shared value system, that's just not going to work. And so the Christianity we have today, it can't reach the positive effects that it's one of those things where believing in it gives it power, where Christianity, it doesn't have enough social sway to get people to not divorce, to not commit crimes, to be nice to each other. And due to that, the church is kind of stuck in this place of impotence.
Yeah. I don't know really what would, change that either. I mean, maybe somebody, maybe a really charismatic person,
you would need a philosophic breakthrough. You would need to create some philosophic substructure in which the worldview that Christianity posits makes sense.
Maybe a sports hero, it's you certainly occasionally still have some, athletes who are very religious, but
no, I mean, the problem is that most people just don't believe. Most people, they can't believe in spiritual forces. And until that happens, the church will continue to decay. I mean, a factor here is that only the religious reproduce, and that's especially pronounced among the educated. And so that would, over demographic terms, make religion stronger. But if our society were to become religious, you would end up with philosophers creating logical structure to rationalize it.
Yeah.
And so it's a chicken and egg thing.
And that's why I do think the Christians, maybe in an alliance with the Darwinists, could probably win.
Yeah. I didn't say this in the video, but I'm a Christian Darwinist fusion. Yeah. And that's why I released the manifesto, because my goal is to fuse them, because I think by fusing them, you win.
Yeah. And and as you pointed out, I think the weakness for Darwinism is that it, it can be very stubborn and can go too far. But as you pointed out, that Christianity does provide, it does require a certain amount of humility, and all these others don't, because as I've sometimes said, if you believe in God, you don't have as much temptation to try to play God.
Yeah. And also, one of the things religion does is that religion establishes the idea that you don't have to be hyper powerful and hyper rich to live a good life. Where I think a lot of people are power obsessed or hedonistic or those sorts of things because they think that's what they need to be to get the respect of their compatriots. And with religion, you create this group cooperation that no, you can be a good person, you can have a family, because in our society, just having a family, working a job, you're viewed with contempt. But if you're in a religious society, you're a respectable citizen if you do that. And so what happens when you don't have religion is the society keeps pushing and pushing and pushing because there's no feedback loop to having being a normal person be okay. And I think there's a factor here that if you are a religious society, people get reproductive success for being a normal person. But if you're not a religious society, you get reproductive success by being a hyper degenerate, being hyper aggressive, whatever, and that's how you find a mate. And so I think religion establishes this idea that if you just live a quiet, peaceful life, you can still be a good person and live a fine life.
I do think some of the Christians they don't quite understand what's going on. Jordan Peterson, apparently, fell in love with Tammy when they were both about 10 years old.
Yeah.
And I just look at myself and said, Jordan, you have no idea what it's like to be out there.
Yeah, exactly.
And a lot of these, I'd probably say the same thing about Nick Freitas. I like Nick Freitas a lot, but he met his wife in high school too. It's like, once you're out of high school and out there on the market, it's really hell and it's not fun.
Yeah. A lot of these, because a video I've been meaning to make is the anthropology of the right and the anthropology of the left. And the right more so than the left is this insane woke core, and then after that is normies who obey the wokes. The right is this crystallization of various alliances that shouldn't be working together, but happen to be forced to due to the left. And the right doesn't even realize that it's all these coalitions. But so you have the Darwinist coalition, you have the fundamentalist Christian, and then I would put Jordan Peterson, Nick Freitas, Ben Shapiro in this moderate Christian camp. And I would probably be part of this, even though I don't think I fit into an easy box. I think I wander around and talk to people, and I play with one box, and then I pass out another box. But I think I'm more aligned with those guys than a lot of other things. But the Jordan Peterson, Nick Freitas, Ben Shapiro crew, and a lot of them have a pretty naive view of what society is descended into. And I'm friends with Nick Freitas. I think he's more aware of this. I think he's more aware of this than the rest. But
because he's Christian.
Yeah. I think he also, his audience, Nick's audience is also heavily young biased. And so I think he's more in tune with these sorts of things than a lot because he talks to a lot of young people. But for a lot of these people, they don't relate to the outside society that well. And I also think things have gotten dramatically worse in just the last 5 years for dating and social life, in which pre-COVID versus post-COVID, there was a tectonic shift that no one talks about, where dating became vastly worse around COVID. And I talk to people who are Gen X, and they just don't get it. And what I try to convey to Gen X people is that dating now, if it was at 100% in 1970, it's at 5% now. It is 1/20th as easy as it was in 1970. I don't think old people can physically comprehend that in the same way that it's difficult to convey to baby boomers that baby boomers just don't understand the fact that Gen Z has 90% less spending money than what they did at Gen Z's age. That's less than half of that's close to half of the money. And imagine telling a baby boomer in 1970, hey, we're going to take half your paycheck. And they're like, what? I can't afford to do anything. Exactly.
Yeah, and I can't remember exactly, but I had a guy a while ago who started college in 1971. And the first thing I said, "What did you pay?" And it was something like $300 or $400 a semester or something like that.
Yeah.
It's really wild how that's happened. I'm not really sure what. I think there are a lot of factors involved with it, but
yeah, it's the secular cycle in Mouse Utopia. One of the videos I've been wanting to make is the 4 things driving our current crisis, because I've crystallized our current world crisis to 4 variables. You have the secular cycle, which is the Peter Turchin 250-year cycle. You have Mouse Utopia. You have the Unabombers over socialization. And then you have the death of God that Nietzsche talks about. I think those 4 things control for all the crises going around the world today.
Yeah, I definitely think we're over socialized. I mean, I think those of us who grew up before, the internet are probably, we can at least try to describe it for you. But for those of you who aren't, it's just so wild to think about.
Yeah. That's the video I'm writing. I'm currently writing a video about over socialization with the Unabomber. I think the Unabomber is one of the most brilliant critics of modernity. Of course, I don't support terrorism, but I think he was spot on. And it's crazy watching old videos, because this is going to sound so black-pilled. It's crazy watching videos from the 80s. People seemed happy. It's like they had life inside of them. I don't know what else to say. Like, you look at videos of them, it's like there's someone there. And then all the buildings are clean and new.
Yeah, it's really went down. I think if you, like I say, watch old sitcoms, there's definitely something that's changed, and, we talked about, things like the extension of childhood, you were expected to, people don't seem to grow up as fast. I mean, I was looking at pictures of my great-grandparents. They were 15 and 23 when they got married. It's
Damn.
In 1879. I don't know. And I don't know how we get out. I don't know how we get back to something normal. It seems, but it's, and where do you think it might still be normal? North Korea's, what's funny is North Korea may have more people than South Korea in 50 years.
Yeah.
As awful as North Korea is.
Exactly. The great thing about the world is it's a natural biological equilibrium which balances itself out. And so when one area gets too crazy, the natural order wipes them out. And then the natural order, it supports and promulgates traits which which it likes and which are pro-social. And so over time, you see a natural Darwinistic selection through the natural law towards better traits. And so the foolishness of our time will be naturally selected out of the gene pool.
I think you have Darwinism among societies too, and the healthiest societies, encourage at least to have more children. And,
yeah. Huh. So any final questions?
Not at this point. Anything else you want to say? You're at WhatIfAltHist on YouTube and some other platforms, and you've got that History 102 channel as well.
Yes.
So yeah, it's been great having you here, Rudyard. It
was wonderful to come. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate having you. We should meet up sometime too. Just
sure thing.
I'm actually thinking about moving out of Austin, so but I can't say for sure yet. So keep up the good work. You're putting out a lot of good content. And by the way, I did not have a good experience at Nick's community, unfortunately. While I really enjoyed Nick's videos, I wouldn't bother with that. But anyway, okay, well, I'm Chris Baker. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel, Escape from the Village, check out my Substack. I'm Chris Baker again. We're out. Thank you.